The housekeeper pressed play on a $40 speaker. Within seconds, two children who hadn't made a sound in 4 years started laughing. Their billionaire father collapsed against the doorframe, watching the impossible unfold. This is the story of how one woman with no medical degree accomplished what 50 specialists couldn't. And if you stay until the end, you'll discover why the greatest transformations in life never come from the people we expect. Before we begin, if emotional billionaire stories that restore your faith in humanity are your thing, hit that subscribe button right now. We pour our hearts into every single story on this channel, and your support means we can keep bringing you these life-changing tales. Now let's dive in. For years, that's how long Marcus Wellington had been living in a mausoleum disguised as a mansion. $9 billion couldn't buy back his wife, couldn't make his twin sons hear his voice, couldn't stop the silence from devouring every room like a cancer. Lucas and Mason, 4 years old, born the same minute their mother, Catherine, drew her last breath. Death, unreachable. At least that's what Marcus had been told by every specialist from Boston to Berlin. The boys moved through the estate like ghosts haunting their own lives. They didn't play, didn't explore, didn't even look at each other most days. They just existed. Two tiny statues carved from loneliness, sitting in their chairs, staring at walls that cost more than most people's houses. Marcus had stopped trying to connect with them 18 months ago. What was the point? Every attempt ended the same way, with those vacant stares that made him feel like the worst father on earth. Then she arrived. Isabella Martinez, 28 years old. No college degree, calloused hands from years of cleaning other people's homes. She showed up for a housekeeper interview with a worn suitcase and a smile that didn't match the tragedy surrounding her. Marcus barely glanced at her during the interview. "Can you start Monday? Keep the mansion clean. Stay out of the way. The boys are complicated. Don't try to engage with them. Just maintain the space." Isabella nodded, but something in her eyes should have warned him. She wasn't the type to follow rules that broke her heart. 3 weeks in, she'd followed protocol perfectly. The mansion gleamed. The boys remained untouched, unreached. But every night, Isabella went to her room and cried into her pillow, because watching those children exist without living was killing something inside her. Then came the Thursday that changed everything. Isabella stood in the industrial kitchen, watching Lucas and Mason sit at the small table like they did every day. Stone-faced, silent, separate even though they were twins. Her chest ached with frustration. She'd grown up in a home where silence was never an option, where music poured from every crack, where even sadness had a rhythm. Her hand moved to her bag before her brain could stop her. She pulled out her compact Bluetooth speaker, the one luxury she owned, and pressed play. Nina Simone's voice erupted into the stillness. Rich, soulful, alive. And then it happened. Lucas's head snapped up like he'd been electrocuted. His eyes went wide. His foot started tapping against the chair leg. Tap, tap, tap. Mason's mouth fell open. Then, and Isabella would replay this moment for the rest of her life, he giggled. A sound. A real, human, beautiful sound from a child everyone said was trapped in permanent silence. Isabella's body moved on pure instinct. She started swaying to the beat, exaggerating every movement, her hips moving, arms sweeping through the air like she was conducting an orchestra only she could hear. "Come on, my brave warriors," she whispered, knowing they couldn't hear but hoping they could feel. Lucas rocked forward, then back, then forward again, mimicking her. Mason slapped his palms on the table, once, twice, then slid off his chair. His little legs wobbled. But he was standing, dancing, his eyes blazing with something that looked dangerously like joy. Lucas followed, determination painted across his tiny face. Isabella dropped to their level and danced with everything she had. The boys responded like flowers turning toward sunlight after years of darkness. Lucas giggled. Mason stomped his feet. Then came laughter, real, unfiltered, gorgeous laughter that filled the kitchen like a miracle. She grabbed Mason's hands and swayed with him. He resisted for half a heartbeat, then melted into it, looking up at her with eyes that practically glowed. Lucas tugged her skirt, impatient, so she took his hand too, and the three of them danced together like the rest of the world had ceased to exist. That's when Marcus walked in. He'd only meant to grab a forgotten file. His mind was on a merger, on numbers, on anything except the hollow ache in his chest. The file slipped from his fingers. He didn't notice. His sons, his unreachable, untouchable sons, were dancing, moving, laughing, Mason's head thrown back, mouth wide open in pure joy. Lucas clutching Isabella's arm for balance but giggling so hard his whole body shook. The sound hit Marcus like a bullet to the chest. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move, could only stand there frozen, watching something he'd been told was impossible. For 4 years, he'd watched them exist in silence, convinced that's all they'd ever do. Now they were dancing in his kitchen to a song he recognized from another lifetime, when Catherine was still alive, when the world still made sense. His hand lifted unconsciously to his chest, pressing against the sharp ache spreading there. Hope, that treacherous, terrifying, beautiful thing he'd sworn never to feel again. Isabella spun once more, then crouched to look into Mason's face, her smile radiant. Lucas clapped, signing something rudimentary with his little hands. Mason copied him, their eyes shining with uncomplicated joy. Marcus's throat burned. He hadn't seen them like this, hadn't believed they could look like this. For the first time in 4 years, there was actual life in their eyes. Raw, real, overwhelming, and at the center of it stood Isabella, the housekeeper he'd barely noticed, drawing something out of his children that 50 specialists and $500,000 in therapy couldn't. He felt dizzy. The silence that had suffocated his house for years had been broken. Not by him, not by science, not by money, but by a woman with a $40 speaker and the audacity to try. He turned and walked away before they could see him, before they could see the tears streaming down his face. But everything had changed, and there was no going back. The next morning, Marcus woke at 4 a.m., drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. He dreamed of Catherine, of the day the twins were born, of her last words. Love them enough for both of us. He'd failed. He knew he'd failed. He sat on the edge of his bed, elbows on knees, head in hands. No matter what he tried to focus on, meetings, contracts, deals, one image kept intruding. Lucas and Mason, laughing. The memory should have filled him with gratitude. Instead, it filled him with terror. Because for 4 years, he'd been told by teams of the world's best specialists that the boys would remain forever isolated, that their connection to the world would always be fragile, uncertain. Yet in minutes, his housekeeper had cracked open what they couldn't. It was exhilarating and absolutely terrifying, because it meant everything he thought he understood about his sons, about his grief, about the silence that had defined their lives. None of it was real. He'd built his entire existence on quicksand. He found Isabella in the kitchen that morning. She was humming. The boys sat at the table, tapping blocks against the wood in something that almost resembled rhythm. Marcus's throat tightened at the sight, but instead of acknowledging the miracle, he did what broken men do. He attacked. "Miss Martinez." His voice came out sharp as a blade. "What exactly do you think you're accomplishing with my children?" She set down her knife, wiped her hands, turned to face him with calm, unwavering eyes. "I was giving them joy. They've earned that." His jaw clenched. "They don't need party tricks. They need structure, therapy, schedules. What you did yesterday wasn't treatment. It was reckless." The accusation hung in the air like poison, but Isabella didn't flinch. She leaned against the counter, steady as stone. "With respect, Mr. Wellington, joy isn't reckless. It's the only thing they've been denied." Her words landed like a slap because somewhere deep down, he knew she was right. "You're overstepping," he managed. Though his voice had lost its steel, she softened her tone but not her stance. "I'm not trying to replace doctors, but I can see your sons as more than a diagnosis. They're children who crave connection. Yesterday they let me in. That means something, whether you're ready to admit it or not." Marcus's hands clenched into fists. He wanted to dismiss her as naive. But the image of Mason's small hand clutching hers refused to release him. Just, he swallowed hard. Just do your job. He turned and walked away, leaving the words he really wanted to say buried in his chest. Days of cold tension followed. Marcus buried himself in work. Isabella moved through the house quietly, her laughter gone. The boys felt it. They clung to her with new desperation, their eyes searching for the warmth that had vanished. Then came the evening that changed everything again. Dinner had ended. Isabella was clearing dishes. Lucas spotted her bag on the chair, the speaker peeking out. His eyes lit up. He slid off his chair, toddled over, pulled the speaker free like treasure, and pressed play. Music spilled out. Mason's face broke into a grin. Before Isabella could react, both boys started stomping their feet, bounding, turning toward her with eyes that said, "Please, please don't let the joy end." For a moment, she hesitated. Marcus's accusations still stung. But then Lucas's hands reached for her, clapping the rhythm. Mason laughed, high-pitched and free. The hesitation melted. Isabella stepped into their circle, bent low, and danced. The boys exploded with laughter, stomping harder, spinning, alive. Upstairs, Marcus heard it. Laughter, clapping, life spilling back into his house like a flood. His body moved before his mind could stop him. Down the stairs, to the kitchen doorway, and there they were, Lucas and Mason, dancing in perfect synchronization, their eyes shining like stars. Then something extraordinary happened. Both boys turned toward him, lifted their little hands, and signed, clumsily but clearly, "Dance, Papa." Marcus's heart lurched so violently he thought he might die right there. His sons had never invited him into anything, never looked at him with such open, hopeful expectation. Panic gripped him. What if he couldn't do it? What if he failed them again? But their hands kept signing, their eyes locked on his. Waiting, Isabella turned too, her face soft, silently urging him forward. He swallowed hard, then stepped into the room. He raised his arms, awkward and terrified, and swayed. The boys squealed with delight, stomped harder, laughed until the sound filled every corner of the kitchen. Marcus crouched low, mimicking their movements, spinning with them, letting himself fall into the glorious chaos of the moment. For the first time in 4 years, he wasn't the billionaire, wasn't the widower, wasn't the man drowning in failure. He was just Papa. And it was enough. That night, long after the boys had been tucked into bed, Marcus sat in his study, staring at the drawer he hadn't opened in 4 years. His hands trembled as he pulled it open. Inside lay a single envelope, yellowed, sealed, never mailed. A letter to Catherine, written 3 weeks after her death. The only time he'd been honest about his deepest fear, that he didn't know how to be a father without her, that he'd always fail their children. He held it for a long time, then stood. His legs carried him down the hall to Isabella's room almost without permission. He knocked softly. She opened the door in simple pajamas, her eyes widening at the sight of him. Unshaven, exhausted, holding something that looked like a confession. "I wrote this a long time ago," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "For Catherine. I never sent it." She nodded once, stepped aside. No questions. He handed her the envelope. She sat on the edge of her bed and carefully opened it. Her eyes moved slowly across the page. Marcus stood nearby, feeling naked under her silence. When she finished, her hands trembled as she folded the letter carefully, holding it like something sacred. She looked up at him. "She would have been proud of you, Marcus." He swallowed hard, not ready to believe it. Not for the empire. Not for the money. Her voice was soft but certain. "She would have been proud because you're still here. You stayed. You're still trying." His head lowered, emotion crashing into the vulnerable place the letter had opened. She rose and stepped closer, placed the letter gently back in his hand. "You were never supposed to be enough alone. No one is." Then she did something that shattered the last of his defenses. She reached out and cupped the side of his face. Not romantically, but with a tenderness that startled him. He leaned into it before he could stop himself. Closed his eyes. "You've never been the villain in this story," she whispered. "Stop treating yourself like one." In that moment, he let her see the pain he'd hidden for 4 years. Neither spoke for a long time. She sat beside him on the bed, close but not touching, their presence enough. He told her everything. About the night he wrote the letter. How Mason had cried for hours and he'd sat outside the nursery door, paralyzed. How Lucas wouldn't let him hold him. How he'd nearly given the boys away, convinced they'd be better off without him. He spoke with brutal honesty, and Isabella listened without judgment. When he paused, afraid of what she'd think, she only murmured, "I'm so sorry you went through that alone." No one had ever said that to him, and hearing it from her made something inside him break open. As he stood to leave, the hour impossibly late, he looked down at the letter, then back at her. "Thank you," he said. The words felt too small for what he meant. Their eyes met, no longer employer and employee, but two broken people holding onto the same fragile truth, that healing doesn't always look heroic. Sometimes it just looks like staying. 1 week later, Isabella had an idea that terrified and excited her in equal measure. She'd been learning sign language every night for 3 weeks, staying up until 2 a.m. with YouTube videos and library books, her notebook filled with sketches of hand positions, arrows, repeated words. Now it was time to try. That afternoon, she knelt on the living room floor with the boys. Marcus had retreated to his office as always, pretending to work. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her hands and signed, "Play." Lucas's eyes went wide. Mason leaned forward, brows knitting in concentration. They'd seen therapists use signs before, but never with this warmth, this patience, this belief. Isabella signed again. "Happy." She exaggerated the motion, then placed her hand against her chest. "Happy." The boys blinked, then tried to mimic her. Their fingers fumbled. Their gestures were sloppy, but the effort was undeniable. "That's right." Isabella's voice trembled with pride. "Yes, Lucas. Yes, Mason. That's happy." Lucas giggled. Mason's lips moved, trying to echo the word aloud. Then Isabella introduced another sign. Her movement slower this time. "Love." She crossed her arms over her chest, her eyes soft as she looked at them. "Love." Mason copied first, clumsily pressing his arms against his chest. His face broke into a smile when she nodded approval. Lucas hesitated, biting his lip, then attempted the gesture too. His fingers tangled, his arms awkward, but when he managed it, he let out a tiny laugh. "That's beautiful," Isabella whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. Upstairs, Marcus had been trying to focus on spreadsheets, but something pulled him from his desk, some invisible thread tugging him downward. He descended the stairs quietly, stopped at the living room entrance, and saw his sons signing with Isabella, communicating, connecting, bridging the silence on their own terms. Shame burned through his chest, hot and suffocating. He had paid countless specialists. Each had insisted progress would be slow, clinical, measured. Yet here was Isabella with no degree, no training beyond late-night scribbles, giving his sons a bridge into the world. And he, their own father, had never even tried to learn their language. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He'd been so consumed with protecting them from disappointment that he'd never actually fought for them. Isabella glanced up and saw him standing there. Their eyes met. She said nothing, just gently gestured for him to come closer. Marcus's throat went dry. His feet felt like concrete, but he forced himself forward. The boys noticed immediately. Their faces lit up. Lucas tugged at his sleeve, babbling unintelligibly but with clear intent. Mason reached for his hand, pulling it closer as if inviting him to participate. "Try," Isabella said softly. "Just one word." Marcus's chest rose and fell too quickly, but then he lifted his hands. They shook as he formed the shape he'd just seen. Simple, direct, imperfect. His lips parted, his voice barely a whisper. "Papa." The reaction was immediate. Lucas gasped, his little hands clapping against his chest before he signed something back, his eyes wide with wonder. Mason laughed, his arms jerky but enthusiastic as he tried to mirror the sign. Both of them turned toward him, their joy unrestrained, as if they'd been waiting for this moment their entire lives. "Papa," Lucas murmured, the syllables broken but audible, and Marcus's heart shattered into a million pieces. Mason leaned forward, hugging his father's arm. For the first time in 4 years, Marcus felt not like a spectator in their lives, but like he actually belonged. The word, trembling as it was, wrapped around him with a force stronger than any wall he'd built. Spring arrived with the delicate touch of new beginnings. Isabella had planned something special, a garden activity with colorful ribbons laid out across the yard, creating a path of wonder. She explained it to the boys in sign, "Walk to the colors." One step, then another. Lucas and Mason looked uncertain, but they understood. It wasn't therapy, it was play. Mason stepped forward first, arms flailing for balance. Lucas followed, more cautious. On the porch, Marcus stood gripping the railing so hard his knuckles turned white, watching his sons do what he once believed impossible. Move forward, fall down, laugh, try again. No specialists, no charts, just two little boys stumbling along a path of color, giggling when they lost balance, getting up without being told. Mason squealed, "Mama!" looking up at the sky with a grin. The sound pierced straight through Marcus's chest. He stepped down from the porch, drawn forward by need stronger than fear. As he neared the path, Lucas turned suddenly, looked straight at him. No fear, no shyness. He raised both hands and signed, "Come, Papa." The breath left Marcus's lungs. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation, and Marcus ran. Not gracefully, not with the poise of a billionaire. He ran like a desperate father, finally ready to meet his children where they lived. He dropped to his knees, arms open, and gathered them both into his chest. Lucas's fingers tangled in his shirt. Mason leaned his forehead against Marcus's collarbone. The sob came raw and uncontained, the kind of cry that has no beginning and no end. Neither boy flinched. They leaned closer, arms tightening around his shoulders as if they understood that this was what love looked like. Messy, loud, imperfect, human. Marcus kissed their foreheads one after the other, signing the word for love over and over. Not because he doubted they knew, but because he needed to say it, needed them to feel it, needed them to carry it forward always. Isabella stood back, hand pressed to her chest, witnessing but not intruding. Marcus looked up at her over the boys' heads, their gazes locked in quiet reverence. He didn't say thank you. There were no words for that kind of gratitude, but she saw it. In the way he held his children, in the way his body folded to fit theirs, in the way his pride had finally given way to something far more sacred, belonging. 6 months later, the Wellington estate was unrecognizable. Laughter echoed through halls that once knew only silence. Toys scattered across floors. Music never stopped playing. Isabella was no longer just a housekeeper. She was family. On a warm evening, Marcus hosted a small garden gathering. Lucas and Mason ran across the grass, signing excitedly to guests with proud smiles. In a quiet corner, Marcus found Isabella under a tree. He handed her a glass of lemonade. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the scene before them. Then Marcus turned to her. "You brought them back to me," he said softly. "You brought me back to them." The words had been growing inside him for months. Isabella touched his arm gently, grounding them both in the reality of what they'd built together. The boys came barreling toward them, dirt on their knees, icing on their cheeks, arms flailing with excitement. Lucas tugged his father's hand. Mason grabbed Isabella's. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. The four of them sat close beneath the tree. Isabella with one twin nestled against her side. Marcus with the other sprawled across his lap. No performance. No moment being crafted for memory. Just life, beautiful in its ordinary chaos, stitched together by small miracles. They passed cookies around. The boys traded pieces like secrets. Marcus leaned in to whisper something to Isabella and she laughed, the sound mixing with the children's joy. In that small circle under the fading light, family redefined itself. Not bound by blood alone, but by presence, by showing up again and again, even in brokenness. Marcus had once believed his mansion stood as a monument to everything he'd achieved. Now he understood it was the living that made it sacred. Rooms meant nothing without footsteps. Silence held no power once met with a child's giggle or a shared glance that said, "We made it." The wealth he'd clung to seemed irrelevant now. What mattered was what they'd built. Not a perfect picture, but a breathing, evolving love. Isabella had never demanded space. She'd simply filled it when no one else could. The Wellington family was reborn that day, not in wealth or status, but in the simple, extraordinary miracle of love, trust, and soundless laughter. What part of this story touched your heart? Drop a comment below. We genuinely love hearing from you. If the story moved you even a little bit, do us a huge favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to Billionaire Bedtime Stories. Every story we share takes days of love and care to bring to life, and your support means we can keep creating these emotional journeys. Thank you for being part of this community. We'll see you in the next story. And remember, the greatest transformations always come from the most unexpected places. Like and subscribe for more stories that will restore your faith in humanity.